Love affairs on movie sets have been around as long as the movies themselves, but our next story about the love triangle between one of America's biggest superstars, Bette Davis, and her husband and her director has an ending as shocking as anything Bette Davis ever lived on the screen. When Bette Davis was assigned the film Old Acquaintance in 1941, the two-time Academy Award winner's second marriage to aviation executive Arthur Farnsworth, also known as Farnsey, was crumbling. But no one, least of all the young director caught between them, realized just how lethal the combination would turn out to be. Fade in, 1941, Warner Brothers Studios. The set of Old Acquaintance, starring the first lady of American cinema, Bette Davis. She's at the height of her career and a low point in her second marriage.
Bette Davis is doing women's pictures with a real edge to them. Either highly sympathetic character or just a real bitch, and we seem to love her doing both.
Off-screen, Bette could play both these characters equally well, as the director of Old Acquaintance, Vincent Sherman, was about to discover. Sherman had been warned about his temperamental superstar.
We went to work on Old Acquaintance, and we got along beautifully. So well that I said to myself, why do people say she's so difficult? She's wonderful to work with.
Near the end of the filming, Vincent and Bette stayed up late one night talking. Out of the blue, Vincent got the surprise of his life.
She said to me, well, Mr. Sherman, it's been fun working with you, and I love you. I said, well, I love you too, meaning I thought she meant I approve, it was nice working with you, and so forth. And then she put her hand on mine, she said, you don't understand. I mean, I really love you. Well, that floored me. I had the slightest idea.
There is a certain ecstasy in wanting things you know you can't get.
That night, I couldn't sleep. I trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do? I was married, had a 3-year-old little girl. She was married to a very handsome, charming guy named Arthur Farnsworth. And I didn't want to tell her, well, I have no interest in you, because I was interested in him. I found her very attractive and very intelligent.
Bette was planning a vacation to Mexico and invited Vincent to join her. Before Vincent could give her an answer, Bette's husband, Arthur Farnsworth, turned up in Vincent's office.
He said, Vince, Bette and I had a fight last night, and she blurbed out and blatted out that she was in love with you and that the two of you were going to Mexico City. I said, I promise you I'm not going to Mexico City with Bette. We shook hands, and I said to him, Fonny, just do me one favor. Don't ever tell Bette that you and I, were talking about her, because she'll hate us both.
Vincent didn't go with Bette to Mexico, but they did agree to begin another picture together, Mr. Skeffington. But shortly before production began, Bette Davis's husband suddenly died.
Farnsworth was walking down Hollywood Boulevard and dropped dead, and it was a shocking thing.
At the inquest, Bette testified that her husband had previously fallen and hit his head in their home in New Hampshire. Bette stayed in seclusion for weeks. When she finally was ready to work, it was Bette Davis, the Ice Queen, who arrived on the set.
It wasn't anything like when she left. This wasn't a woman who said, I love you. But I thought, well, she's just gone through a hell of a lot, so that was all, just businesslike.
Late one night on the set, Bette invited Vincent to her dressing room for a drink. She then confessed the terrible truth behind her husband's death, a story as dramatic as any film she ever made. It started with an argument Bette had with her husband as the train was leaving for Mexico.
She said, he put me on the train. He had been drinking that morning. And then he turned to me and he said, oh, and by the way, Vince Sherman is not going to meet you in Mexico City. And of course, that threw her into a rage. And she said, we'll talk about Vince later on. The train is moving, get off the train. But he kept taunting her, and she pushed him off the train. And she said that she leaned out and looked back. He had fallen and hit his head, and he was holding his head on the ground, sitting on the ground. And she said, I think that's when he hurt himself, which caused his death later on.
Davis then told him that she lied at the inquest about what caused her husband's death.
And she says, and that was my guilt. She was crying. Tears were rolling down her face. I said, I'm so sorry. And that night, we went to bed together. And that began the affair.
The morning after their affair began, Vincent arrived on the set to find a stunning transformation.
The cameraman said to me, my God, she's like a different woman this morning, isn't she? And I was dying laughing inside, but I couldn't tell anybody about it, you see. She'd be wonderful for 4 or 5 days. Then she'd begin to tighten up. We'd go to bed again, and she'd loosen up again.
Betty may have found a sympathetic ear in Vincent, but he wasn't the only person she was confessing her guilt to. And that forced Warner Brothers president Jack Warner into another Hollywood cover-up.
Betty Davis, with her Yankee honesty and integrity, ran all over town saying, "I killed him, I killed Farnsey." The DA's office got an eyebrow raised, and Jack Warner made a telephone call to the DA's office, and the inquiry disappeared.
Davis and Sherman's affair ended when filming wrapped, and the two never saw each other again. Whether or not Betty Davis was directly responsible for the death of her husband, if the public had ever found out, it would have been devastating to her career. But it was covered up, and Betty Davis went on to win 4 Oscar nominations, and her place in Hollywood history is secure. Since the demise of the studio system in the 1950s, the scandals didn't stop, but the cover-ups did. As movie stars became free agents without powerful moguls to protect them, they could no longer get away with murder. Or could they? If you still think you know everything about the movies, just wait until next time, when we reveal more of Hollywood's best-kept secrets. I'm Edward Albert.